We got 10:30. I'm going to get started here and ask everyone to mute themselves, please, and join me in the bracha for the reading and studying of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We are in Parshat V'etchanan, which is the second of 11 Parshiot in the book of Devarim, and number 45 of 54 readings, chapters. The second triennial is chapter 5, verse 1 through chapter 6, verse 25, and it contains both the second set of the Aseret Hadibrot, the 10 words or statements, and of course the Shema and the first part of the V'ahavta. So as I say, there's a lot here, and I want to make sure we have sufficient time to cover it, and hopefully the first Haftorah of consolation from the prophet Yeshayahu. If you are in Hertz, you will find that on page 765. Otherwise, find Devarim, second chapter, V'etchanan, chapter 5, verse 1. So, having conquered Sichon and Og, whose lands were given to Israel, Moses hoped that perhaps he might indeed be permitted to enter the rest of the land as well. So he prayed for the right to cross the Yarden. And the Midrash states that based on certain words in the text and the gematria, the numerical value, that Moses pleaded over 500 times with God to let him into the land. And of course, every plea was rebuffed, but God did permit him to see the land.
515 times.
There you go. So I'm going to start by reading some of the overview in Kahot, V'etchanan, and then from Nehama, and then we'll get into the text itself. So here we go. As we have pointed out, the book of Deuteronomy is in effect a restatement of the first 4 books of the Torah, couched in such a way as to make them relevant for the generation that was about to enter the land of Israel. As such, the first Parshah of Deuteronomy, Parshat Devarim, parallels Genesis, the first book of the Torah. Just as the book of Genesis describes the historical background for the Torah in general, detailing the necessity for the creation of the Jewish people, so does Parshat Devarim describe the historical background for the restatement of the Torah in the book of Deuteronomy, detailing the events that necessitated the 40-year detainment in the desert and the rise of a new generation that would enter the land. Good evening, or good morning, Michelle, Cookie, and Sarita. We're reading from the overview in Kahot on V'etchanan. The present Parshah, Parshat V'etchanan, parallels Exodus, the second book of Torah. The book of Exodus laid the theological underpinnings of the Jewish people's existence. Their distinction from other peoples, the Exodus, their unique covenant with God and attendant belief system, which was the giving of the Torah, and their purpose as a people, to make a world a home for God as encapsulated in the Mishkan or tabernacle. In a parallel manner, Parshat V'etchanan describes the spiritual uniqueness of the new generation, as we will discuss presently, restates the covenant with God on their level, which is the repetition of the Aseret Hadibrot, the 10 words or statements, and transforms the imperative to make the world God's home into the basis central statement of Judaism, the Shema. This explains why in Parshat V'etchanan, Moshe recounts historical events that preceded those he reviewed in Parshat Devarim. Although the events reviewed in Parshat Devarim took place later chronologically, in terms of the thematic development of the book of Deuteronomy, they come first. They provide the rationale for the repetition of the drama of Mount Sinai, the giving of the Torah, that forms the subject of Parshat Va'etchanan. This Parsha opens with Moses' description of how, at the end of the 40-year detour in the desert, he once again pleaded with God to let him enter the land of Israel, and how God refused his request. In light of what we had just said, it would seem that this should form part of the historical material reviewed in the preceding Parashah, which concludes with the events immediately preceding Moses' prayer. Why then is it placed here at the beginning of Parshat Va'etchanan? Moses knew that the generation standing before him was not on the same level of spiritual perception as that of the preceding generation, who had witnessed the miracles of the Exodus and the giving of the Torah. He therefore understood that their confrontation with the materiality of the physical world would be a struggle, and that it would take time, perhaps a long time, until they would accomplish the purpose for which they were entering the land. He therefore wanted to accompany them in the land in order to boost their divine consciousness as much as possible to his level. True, they had not seen what he and his generation had seen, but they might be inspired by the intensity of his communion with God. If he could cross the Jordan with them, it might give them the strength to conquer the land and take possession of it in the fullest, most spiritual sense. As we will see, the spiritual perception of the generation of the desert compared to that of the generation of the conquest was like that of sight compared to hearing. Sight compared to hearing. When we see something, we do not need to be convinced of what we saw. We know it to be so. After all, we saw it. In contrast, when we hear something or hear about something, we may be convinced of what we had heard, but our conviction can be overturned by persuasion and argument. Seeing is a direct perception and therefore incontrovertible, whereas hearing is indirect and therefore subject to challenge. Thus, even if the Jews of the generation entering the land of Israel would not doubt the truth of their Jewish beliefs for a moment, the facade of materiality would still have a louder voice in their minds than it ever could have had in their parents. The reality of God, the subordination of the physical to the spiritual, had simply not been burned into their souls with the same intensity. Thus, Moses wanted to impart this spiritual sight to the new generation. God, you took the initiative to show your servant your magnanimity. Please let me cross over and see the good land. Had he been able to see the land from within his eyes, it would have looked different to the entire Jewish people. But God only let him see the land from afar. Ascend to the peak of Mount Nebo, lift your eyes westward, northward, southward, and eastward, and see it, but only from afar, with your eyes, for you will not cross this Jordan River. Resigned to the fact that his people would not attain this level of divine perception, Moses instructed them to at least listen to the decrees. Shema, hear, listen, understand in the laws that I am teaching you, thus setting the tone for the rest of his address to them, and indeed for the rest of the book of Deuteronomy. But why did God refuse Moses' request to enter the land? Why did he not want the Jewish people to attain Moses' level of spiritual perception, which would enable them to accomplish their task in the land much swifter and better? The answer, of course, is that despite the advantages of sight over hearing, there is also an advantage of hearing over sight. True, when we see something, our sense of the reality of what we have seen is much stronger than when we only hear about it. However, this experience of certainty is solely due to the force of the experience and not to any work we have done in refining our perception. It is certainly imposed upon us from without, rather than one that solidifies gradually from within. Therefore, its effect on us as a people, albeit powerful, is superficial and ephemeral. Once we are no longer looking at what we saw, our experience of it begins to fade, eventually becoming weak enough to be challenged. In contrast, the conviction of truth we arrive at indirectly engages us to a much greater and more profound degree. In the course of reaching this conviction, we have to struggle with the arguments or perceptions posed by the world, which challenges and conflicts with this truth. By answering and overcoming these tests, we are changed in the process. Before I read Nehemiah, if you will go to chapter 4, verse 3 in the Hanan, there's something I want to point out. Chapter 4, verse 3. Your eyes have witnessed what God did regarding Baal Peor, that every man who followed Baal Peor, Adonai, your God, destroyed him from within you. Verse 4. Verse 4. But you who cling to Adonai, your God, all of you are alive today. But you who cling to Adonai, your God, all of you are alive today. This is always chanted just before we read from the Torah. Va'atim hadvekim b'Adonai Elohechem chayim kulchem hayom. That's where it comes from. So again, you know more Torah than you think you do. That one verse every Shabbat morning is chanted by the Gabbai before people are called up to read from the Torah. Now, back to our text, but before we dive in, chapter 5 is about the legal obligations to perform the commandments. So before we dive into the individual text, I want to read from Nehemiah. It's called Doing the Right and Decent Thing. The main principles of Judaism, the prohibition of idolatry, the principles of the unity, love, and fear of God, the Decalogue, the duty of studying the Torah, all are given an honorable mention in this Sidra. It is constantly emphasizing the obligation to actually carry out and faithfully observe all the precepts contained in the Torah. Remember, Judaism is about a deed, not creed. Okay, it's all in the action, what we do. So now come some verses as part of this. Now, O Israel, which is in chapter 4, verse 1, listen to the statutes and judgments which I am teaching you for the purpose of practice. And again, Moses says, listen. Chapter 4, verse 5, see. Now at sea, I have taught you statutes for you to practice in the land you are going to possess. Then again, as a concluding refrain to the account of the giving of the Torah, chapter 5, verse 29, which we will read from in a little bit, you shall be careful to do as the Lord your God has commanded you, stray not to the right or to the left. After these numerous exhortations to put the commandments, statutes, and judgments into practice in their daily lives, the Torah once again calls upon us to, in chapter 6, verses 17 and 18, diligently observe the commandments of the Lord your God, his testimonies and statutes, which he commanded you, and do what is right and good in the eyes of the Lord. Now, the sages pick up on this, and this is where Nehemiah is going to go with it. Do what is right and good in the eyes of the Lord. The question that immediately springs to mind is, surely this exhortation to do what is right and good is already implied in all the numerous injunctions already enjoined in the Torah. Surely one who strictly obeys all the positive and negative commands in the Torah, ipso facto, fulfills the admonition to do what is right and good in the eyes of the Lord. What new obligation, then, does this admonition imply? Or is it perhaps merely a summary that has all been stated previously? We must, of course, assume that the Torah does not multiply injunctions merely for rhetorical effect. We have therefore to seek the specific contribution of this verse to the whole, one which we could not have deduced from any other dictum in the Torah. Every word in Torah is there for a reason, and every word has meaning. Both Rashi and Ramban, Nachmanides, explain that this verse implies a further divine injunction not included in what has been recorded previously. So Rashi says that which is right and good, this implies a compromise beyond the letter of the law. Ramban, Nachmanides, this time agreeing with Rashi, which implies many times he does not, elaborates on this explanation. The idea behind this command is as follows. At the beginning, God, asked us to observe his statutes and testimonies, which he had commanded us. And now he wished to add that you should do that which is upright and good in his eyes, even in regard to those things where no specific divine command applies, since he loves that which is good and upright. This is a very important principle, since it is impossible to record every detail of human behavior in the Torah, embracing man's relations with his neighbors and friends, his business affairs, national and local welfare. But after God, had made reference to many aspects, such as thou shalt not go tale-bearing, thou shalt not take vengeance nor bear a grudge, thou shalt not stand by the blood of your neighbor, thou shalt not curse the deaf, thou shalt rise up before the hoary head, etc. He included a general injunction to do that which is good and upright in every matter, accepting where necessary even a compromise in a legal dispute and going beyond the letter of the law. Back to Nechama. Ramban's words will become clearer if we compare them with another precept occurring in the Torah, enunciating the most sublime principle of divinely ordained conduct. In Leviticus chapter 19, verse 2, God says through Moses, "Speak unto the congregation of the children of Israel, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." But one question still remains for us to clarify. Surely he who observes all the precepts in the Torah will find himself of necessity fulfilling the highest principles of holiness enumerated in the above citation. Holiness and righteousness are surely the logical concomitants of total observance of the divine precepts. It is conceivable that one who observes loyally all the moral and ritual observances of the Torah should fall short of the standards of holiness and uprightness implied in the injunctions already referred to of "you shall be holy," and "thou shalt do that which is upright and good." According to Ramban, such a state of affairs is indeed conceivable. Commenting on the above verse from Leviticus, he states, so now I'm going to read from Ramban, Nachmanides. "Separate yourselves from immorality, for wherever you find safeguards against immorality, you find holiness." This is Rashi's interpretation, but Talmudic comment on this same text limits itself to the following general phrase: "You shall be separate." Remember, Ivri, where Hebrew comes from, means the other, separate. In my opinion, the separation, not my opinion, Ramban, Nachmanides, the separation referred to here is not merely to abstention from immorality, as Rashi maintains, but rather to the abstention invariably referred to in the Talmud, the practitioners of which were termed Perushim, ascetics. Since the Torah warned us against immorality and forbidden foods, but permitted marital relations and the partaking of meat and wine, the immoderate person might abuse these dispensations, overindulging in permitted sexual relations and in eating and drinking, maintaining in common with all foolish people that this was not specifically prohibited by the Torah. He would be a fool by authorization of the Torah. For this reason, the Torah adds to its list of explicit prohibitions and injunctions a general admonition to be holy, to sanctify oneself through minimizing his indulgence in even permitted enjoyments, in food and drink and sex. The Nazirite abstainer is called holy by the Torah. Similarly, every man should sanctify himself till he attains a higher state of holiness and separation, as it was said of Rav Chia that he never indulged in an idle conversation. That ends Ramban's explanations and additional insights. Because just if something is permitted doesn't mean that you should overindulge in what is permitted. Ramban thus shows how it is possible for a man to keep to the letter of the Torah and yet violate its spirit, becoming a fool with the authorization of the Torah itself, or, God forbid, an ascetic. Often in everyday life, there are cases to which no direct and explicit injunction in the Torah applies. But we are called upon to act in these circumstances in accordance with the general principle of holiness and righteousness. This is the implication of these two admonitions. You shall be holy, and you shall do which is upright and good. So even if it's permitted, in the back of your mind should be the two on your shoulder. You shall be holy, you shall do what is upright and good. We may note that in the former, Ramban confines his examples to precepts governing relations between man and his maker, while in the latter, he refers to those between man and man. Adam lamakom and Adam lechavero. Adam lamakom, between man and his maker. Adam v'chero, between man and his fellow. And I've talked about this previously. Our rabbis explain the verse in our Sidra to refer to relations between man and man, in which the individual is called upon not always to stand upon his rights, but rather to agree to a compromise in the interests of a higher morality. Here we quote an instructive example of the application of this divine exhortation to practice holiness in our everyday lives. Now, this is from the Talmud, Baba Metzia. Rabba Bar Hana's porters broke for him his jars of wine. The Gemara explains that the contract made the porters liable for breakages. He, the rabbi, took their cloaks as a pledge for the compensation they were liable to pay. The porters came to Rav to plead their case. Said Rav to him, "Give them back their cloaks." Bar Hana replied, "Is this the law?" Rav replied, "Yes, in order that you may go in the way of the upright," quoting from Mishlei, Proverbs. So he returned them their cloaks. The porters then said to him, "We are poor men and have worked hard all day. We are hungry and have nothing." Said Rav to him, "Go and pay them their wages." Bar Hana replied, "Is this then the law?" Rav replied, "Yes." And again he quotes from Proverbs, "And the paths of the righteous shalt thou keep." So, and here's a perfect example where Rav Bar Hana was right in the law itself, but it was the letter of the law, and the other Rav was saying to him, "No, that's not the spirit of the law." And that's where compromise takes precedent, because you shall be holy and you shall do what is right and is good. A further example.
Stuart, isn't there another example somewhere where they had to give their tools or something, but they were only allowed to keep them from the people overnight so that they could give the tools or something back in the morning so that
that's in the Torah, where you can't keep from someone that which they need for their wage or for their, in other words, if you take his blanket, you must return it at night when they sleep. If you take their tools, you must return it in the day so they can earn their livelihood.
It was collateral.
Yes.
You took something as collateral, you had to return it for its appropriate use.
A further example of the supreme importance of acting in the spirit rather than the letter of the law is epitomized in the following rabbinic saying. Again, from Baba Metzia in the Talmud. Said Rav Yochanan, Jerusalem was destroyed only because they acted in accordance with the letter of the Torah and did not go beyond it. The practical legal implications of the general moral injunctions may be seen from the following restatement of rabbinic rules in the Rambam Maimonides Code. These admonitions to be holy and deal uprightly were not intended to be merely high-sounding platitudes. So here's in the Rambam's Code, I'm going to read what he says. He who sells his land to another is obligated to give his neighbor who has an adjoining field precedence in any sale. Even if the purchaser is a scholar, a neighbor, and a kinsman of the vendor, and the adjoining landowner an ignorant man and a complete stranger, the latter takes precedence and may evict the purchaser. This is in accordance with the principle stated in scriptures, thou shalt do that which is right and good. Our sages said that since it is all one sale, it is only right and good that the adjoining landowner should have a prior right of purchase over the one whose fields are far away. The right of first refusal should go to that individual. So now it goes on. A court that has made an order for the creditor to take the actual property of the debtor or property under mortgage in the hands of a purchaser, and subsequently the debtor or the purchaser of heirs acquire enough means and bring the money to the creditor, the property may be discharged, and such a seizure for debt is always returnable to the original owner in accordance with the principle, thou shalt do that which is right and good. In other words, just because you can doesn't mean you should. Although by law it would seem that a man can sell his land to anyone he wishes, the Torah demands the exercise of the maximum moral consideration. So now we're going to get into the text. In chapter 5, verse 1. Moses called all of Israel and said to them, Shema Yisrael, hear Israel, the statutes and the laws that I am relating in your presence today, for you are to study them and be careful to fulfill them. When we are called the people of the book, we are called the people of the book because we read and study Torah, not because we're well educated and literate and read a lot of novels. That's missing the point entirely. The point is to read and study the Torah. 2 and 3. Adonai made a covenant with us at Horeb, with all of us. Adonai, our God, made a covenant with us at Horeb. 3, not only with our fathers did Adonai make this covenant, but with us. We who are here today, all of us alive, which is eternally true. 4, panim b'panim, face to face. God spoke with you at the mountain from within the fire. Punim apunim, face to face. There were at least 1 million witnesses. No other faith can state that. No other faith. It's usually a revelation to one person. Israel, over 1 million people heard and saw face to face. 5. I'm going to read from Kohot, verse 5. When God repeated each commandment separately, you only heard the first 2 directly from him. I, Moses, stood as an intermediary between God and you at that time, in order to tell you the word of God regarding the last 8 commandments. For you were afraid of the fire. You did not want to ascend the mountain, saying. So the Midrash tells us that the souls left the bodies of the Israelites upon the first commandment, and God returned their souls to them. And then after speaking the second commandment, their souls left their body again, and God returned them. And after that, they went to Moshe Rabbeinu and said, please tell us what he said. So here we go with the Aseret HaDibrot. Verses 6 through 19 are the repetition. Now, before I get into the actual commandments, I want to read from Hasidic Insights what they have to say about verses 6 through 19. The repetition of the 10 commandments. In preparation for the giving of Torah at Mount Sinai, the people completed a thorough process of spiritual and mental purification, thereby earning the most intense revelation of God the world had ever witnessed. The force of this revelation purged them completely of evil inclinations and the effects of sin, enabling them to achieve consummate divine consciousness. This divine consciousness was channeled into the world via the tablets later carved by God, which he inscribed the 10 commandments. But as has been seen, despite the exalted spiritual level that the people attained through the giving of Torah, they still lacked a powerful yearning for divinity that is known only to a penitent soul. So God coerced them into the sin of the golden calf in order to afford them this advantage as well. Although only a small percentage of the people were actually guilty of this sin, the Torah records somewhere around 3,000, and most were of the mixed multitude. The rest were implicated by their failure to prevent it. What a great lesson. If you see evil and you sit by and let evil take place, you are guilty. In this way, they all participated in the sin. They were therefore all able to feel the yearning associated with penitence. This reality of yearning for God was reflected in the second set of tablets. God inscribed them too, but Moses was the one who carved them. And as such, they expressed humanity's aspiration towards divinity, as opposed to the first set of tablets, which express God's unsolicited gift of revelation. In this Parshah, Moses describes how God gave the 10 commandments the first time, before the sin of the golden calf. Nonetheless, he is speaking long after God had replaced the first tablets with the second ones. Thus, his repetition of the 10 commandments expresses the spiritual state of reality embodied in the second tablets. If you remember in the overview, it stated that the events that took place that are recounted in Viet Hanan took place chronologically before those events recounted in Devarim, because again, the Torah is not a history book. It doesn't go in chronological order. The differences between the description of the giving of the Torah in context of the historical narrative in Parshat Yitro and the description of Moses's review here in Parshat Viet Hanan also reflect the differences between the first and second tablets. In Parshat Yitro, emphasis is placed on how the divine revelation shook and shocked both nature and the Jewish people. Quote, there was thunder and lightning, an exceedingly loud blast of a ram's horn. All the people in the camp trembled. The whole of Mount Sinai was in smoke, unquote, and so on. The image is that of a searing revelation that destroyed the power of evil and its hold over the people. When the people expressed their fear of this direct revelation, Moses replied, this was exactly the point, that this awesome experience nullified their sense of self and their overwhelming experience of God. In Parshat Viet Hanan, however, the emphasis is on how the divine message was absorbed and internalized by the people. You were shown, seeing versus hearing. Again, in order to know that God is the only God, God spoke to you face to face. God spoke these words to your entire assembly, and so on. This time, when Moses recalls how the people expressed their fear, he records God's reaction, that they were right in being afraid, and that they should indeed strive to retain at least something of this fear of God. Yirah, fear. Since God leaves room for people to exist on a lower level of divine consciousness, in which they retain their own sense of self, it is therefore necessary for them to know how to fear him. Because we think we are independent beings, because God withdrew his essence so that nature could survive, we need to know how to have fear and awe of God. Nonetheless, the context, as we said, is in the context of the giving of the first tablets. In fact, after Moses recounts the giving of the Torah, he pauses in his review of the historical narrative of the Jewish people and discusses how the recollection of the giving of the Torah should engender feelings of love for God and loyalty to him. He does not resume his review of the historical narrative, picking up with the sin of the golden calf and its aftermath, including the giving of the second tablets, until well into the next Parshah, Akev. This discontinuity emphasizes the fact at this point, Moses is focusing on the original, unbounded relationship between God and his people that existed when they possessed the first tablets. We thus learn that even in our present state of reality, that of the second tablets, we can and should retain a residual taste of the pure reality we knew briefly when we possessed the first tablets. In other words, although Moses is addressing the generation that had not witnessed this revelation at Sinai, and that is living in the post-fall reality of consciousness, he is teaching them that they must still nurture a vision of the pristine pre-fall reality. This memory of their original, ideal, spiritual state will be essential to their success in their encounters across the Jordan, as is their clear understanding of their own existential reality. On a deeper level, the first account of the Ten Commandments, couched in God's first person, is what allows us to experience God's presence in the Torah as we are studying it. This experience prevents us from forgetting that the study of the Torah is a spiritual encounter between God and us, and not merely an intellectual pursuit. The second account of the Ten Commandments, couched as part of Moses's address to the people, enables us to employ our own human intellect in the study of Torah in order to internalize it, absorb its message fully, In this way, the goal of making this world into a home for God is achieved. So now we come to verse 6 with the second telling of the Aseret HaDibrit, the first commandment. I am Adonai your God, who took you out of the land of Egypt, the house of slavery. Now, commandment 7, the second commandment you will find in verses 7 to 10. No idol worship. Avodah zarah is a no-no. You will not have any other gods in my presence. Do not make for yourself a statue of any representation that is in the sky above, or that on the earth below, or that in the waters beneath the sea. For do not bow to them. Do not serve them. For I am Adonai, your God, jealous Almighty, who reckons the sins of parents for the third generation and the fourth generation of my enemies, and performs kindliness for thousands of generations for those who love me and for those who guard my commandments. Now, I'm going to read verse 10 out of Kohot. And here we go. But in contrast, I am a God who shows kindness for at least 2,000 generations to the descendants of those who love me and worship me alone out of that love, and for 1,000 generations of descendants of those who observe my commandments solely out of fear or respect. So you see that love is such a higher level than fear or awe of God, that God will show kindness to 1,000 generations of those who fear or respect him, but 2,000 generations to those who do it out of love for God. Such is the difference between being motivated by love and being motivated by fear or respect. So 11, verse 11, the third commandment. Do not swear, using the name of God, your God, in vain. For Adonai will not hold innocent whoever swears by his name. So you should have sincerity in speech. Avoid oaths. 12 through 15 are all about Shabbat observance. And I want to read what Hertz has to say before I read those particular verses. You will notice observe is shamor, which is one version of the 10 Commandments, the first set in Yitro, but zachor, remember, in this iteration. So actually it says shamor, preserve. So observe, shamor, in Exodus, zachor. I was wrong. It's just the opposite. So in this second version of the tablets, it's shamor, observe, preserve. In Exodus, the first tablets say zachor, remember. Tradition explains that the latter refers to the positive precepts in connection with Shabbat, because observing, preserving is positive to its sanctification by wine, prayer, and Shabbat joy. I'm sorry, remember, I'm getting myself all mixed up. Remember is in connection with Shabbat to its sanctification, the positive precepts. Whereas observe Shabbat means refraining from desecrating through labor by self or dependence. So we remember Shabbat by the positive mitzvot, and we observe Shabbat by refraining from the negative mitzvot. Hence the addition here concerning the resting of servants and the reminder of the bondage in Egypt. Tradition also says that both words Observe and remember, Shamor and Zachor were communicated by God simultaneously. That was one of the miracles. The fourth commandment in Deuteronomy, though different in form, does not imply anything that has not been revealed by God on Mount Sinai. Moses uses a stronger word here because in his exhortation, he has a practical object in view, the observance of God's command by the people. So here we go. Shamor et Yom HaShabbat, Lakad Sho. Preserve the days of Sabbath to sanctify it as God your God commanded you. 6 days will you work, perform all your labor. But on the seventh day, Shabbat for Adonai your God, do not perform any labor. You, your son, your daughter, your male slave, and your female slave, your ox, your donkey, and all your animals, and the non-Jew who dwells in your cities, in order that your male slave will rest, and your female slave like you. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Again, it connects. Why? Because you were slaves in Egypt. And God, your God, took you out of there with a strong hand and extended arm. That is why God, your God, commanded you to celebrate Shabbat day. So unlike before, where the reason for Shabbat was God rested on the seventh day of creation, there's an additional reason, because you were slaves in Egypt. So you must rest, as must all your family and any slave that you own. Of course, Jews created and invented the weekend because work was 7 days a week. And look how we've returned to where we were before giving of Torah. We have that electronic leash called email and phone and instant communication. And we're slaves to our own technology. And we work 7 days a week. And we desecrate the whole intention of Shabbat. Oh, but I'm a Reformed Jew. I don't have to follow that. Okay. Rashi says this about you were a slave in Egypt. Remember you were a slave, etc. He freed you on the condition that you be his servant. Otherwise, why mention the slavery in Egypt here? The condition of freedom is mentioned with particular reference to Shabbat because abstention from work is especially difficult. Oh, don't we know that in today's society? So 16, the fifth commandment. Honor your father and your mother in the way Adonai your God commanded you, in order that you live long and in order that you have a good on the land that God your God is giving you. So 2 points I want to make here. A sound national life can only result from a sound family life, right? Shalom bayit, peace at home. Second, there's only 2 places in the Torah where we're told if you follow this commandment, you will have long life. And this is one of them. Honor your father and your mother. Anybody want to care to guess what the second promise of long life is stated? Ken, you can even join in on this one if you know it. Ken's shaking his head. That you must, what?
Observe Shabbat?
No. If you go up in the tree and the mother bird is there, you must shoo the mother bird away to take the eggs from the nest. And if you do that, you will have long life. Those are the only two instances in the Torah where you were told your life will be long if you follow those mitzvot. 17 is the 6th through 9th commandment. So you get 4 for the price of 1. And Jews love a deal, right? Do not murder, not kill, as is mistranslated. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not kidnap. Do not testify against your neighbor in vain. So 18, no coveting. Do not covet your neighbor's wife. Do not desire your neighbor's house, his field, his male slave, his female slave, ox, donkey, anything else that belongs to your neighbor. So if you borrow a tool from your neighbor, like Dagwood's Herb does from Dagwood all the time and never returns it, isn't that coveting? So 19 through 30 have to deal with the manner in which the Decalogue was delivered. And this is the difference between the seeing and the hearing, which of course we spoke about at length in the overview and subsequently. So 19 through 30. And I'm going to read 19 from Kohot. Verse 19. God spoke these words to you, your entire assembly at the mountain, out of the midst of the fire, the normal cloud and the thick cloud, with a great voice, not pausing for breath as humans must. So God continuously spoke, never stopping to breathe in or out, which of course he's God. Never again will God reveal himself publicly to this degree. Later, during my first 40 days on the mountain, he inscribed the 10 commandments on 2 stone tablets and gave them to me. So Hasidic insights have this to say: a great voice not pausing. One meaning of the expression not pausing is that the voice of God at Mount Sinai continued and continues to be revealed in the prophecies and teachings of the prophets and sages of each generation. In other words, God continues to speak to us. The fact that these prophecies and teachings were not explicitly articulated when the Torah was first given is simply because the world and the Jewish people did not yet require them. They were nonetheless implicit in the original revelation of the Torah. As has been mentioned, God addressed each Jew individually on Mount Sinai. Hebrew has different forms for the singular you and the plural you. The word for your in the opening statement of the 10 commandments, I am God, your God, is in the singular. That's an important point. I am God, your God is in the singular. By extension, then, the words of every prophecy and teaching uttered by a true Torah sage are addressed to each Jew individually. The second meaning of God's words, not pausing, is that the voice of God did not cease once it was heard in Hebrew, but rather split into the 70 seminal languages of humanity. God thus addressed not only each individual Jew, but also every human being, thereby obligating all humanity for all time to respond to his call to observe the Noahide commandments, the 7 Noahide laws that all Gentiles are encumbered to observe. By translating the Torah into all the earth's languages, God also informed us that the Torah may be studied in any language. So that lame excuse that I don't know Hebrew, so I can't study Torah, sorry, won't cut it. By doing so, we elevate that language, utilizing it for holy purpose. As has been mentioned, this is also why God later had Moses translate the entire Torah into all 70 languages. Okay, back to the text. Verses 20 through 28, I'm going to read out of Kohot. When you heard the voice, 20, from out of the midst of the darkness, while the mountain was burning with fire, you approached me, all the heads of your tribes and your elders. 21, and you said, behold, God, our God, has shown us his glory and his greatness. We heard his voice from the midst of the fire. We have seen today that God can speak directly with human beings, and with his help, they can miraculously survive the intensity of this experience and continue to live. 22, but we want to receive the Torah in the framework of our own natural existence. So now, why should we die? For this great fire will consume us. If we continue to hear the voice of a God, our God, anymore without him keeping us miraculously alive, we will die. And that's where the Midrash came up from that, extrapolated that their souls left them after the first commandment was stated from God directly, returned to them, and then left again when God stated the second commandment and returned to them. 23, for who is there of all flesh who heard the voice of the living God speaking from the midst of the fire as we have and lived? 24, rather, you should approach God by yourself. Hear all that God our God will say, and you, Moses, should speak to us all that God our God will speak to you. And we will study, and we will do it. Na'aseh v'nishma. For my part, I was deeply disturbed over this attitude, Moses saying, shouldn't you have preferred to learn directly from God rather than from me? 25, but God heard the sound of your words when you spoke to me. And God said to me, I have heard the sound of the words of this people, which they have spoken to you. They have spoken well. 26, if only their hearts would be like this, to revere me, to keep all my commandments for all time, that it might go well with them and with their children forever. 27, so go say to them, return to your tents, since you will not have to be ready at all times for divine communication. You may resume conjugal life, which occasionally entails becoming richly defiled, for which reason I told you to refrain from it in preparation for the giving of the Torah. 28, but as for you, Moses, you must from now on separate from your wife, since you must at all times maintain the highest level of ritual purity in order to speak with me at any moment. And remember, Miriam was stricken with Sara'at because she spoke Lashon Hara, admonishing Moses for separating from his wife. And this is why he did. In this sense, stay here on your present level of ritual purity in order to be able to converse with me. And I will speak to you all the commandments, rules, and ordinances whenever I deem it necessary in order for you to teach them to the people, that they may perform them correctly in the land that I am giving them to possess. So here is one man who had a reason, an excuse for being available 24/7, because he had to maintain such a high level of ritual purity to be able at any moment to receive God. Because remember, God spoke to him, punim, face to face. So verse 29. This is where Nehemiah picks up on doing right and good, as I read to you at the beginning of Torah study. You will be careful to fulfill as Adonai your God has commanded you. Do not deviate right or left. 30, along the entire way that Adonai your God commanded you shall you go, in order that you live and enjoy good, live long in the land that you are inheriting. So God is speaking here to the nation of Israel, not individual Israel. So that if as a nation you follow my rules, statutes, and ordinances, you will live long in the land and prosper. So chapter 6, the Shema and V'ahavta. So 1 to 3, these are the mitzvot that God commanded, so you will benefit and multiply exceedingly. So here we go. This is the mitzvah, the statutes, which are chukim. Remember statutes, chukim, those which are beyond intellect, and we follow because God said to. And the laws, mishpatim, that God your God commanded to teach you to fulfill the land that you are crossing over there to inherit, in order that you will fear Adonai, your God, to preserve all his statutes and commandments, shamor, observe, preserve all his statutes and commandments that I am commanding you, for you and your son, your grandson, all the days of your life, in order that you live long. You will heed, Israel, the nation, and you will be careful to fulfill so that you will benefit, and so that you will multiply exceedingly, as God of your forefathers, spoke about you, a land flowing with milk and honey. So now comes a plug to attend Shabbat services this Saturday, so you can hear the Shema and V'ahavta chanted in the Torah trope, not in the nusach that we say it in, or that we chant it in, but the Torah trope. Listen, Israel, Adonai is God, Adonai is eternal. So 5 cities of refuge, which I've read from before. Lawrence Rabbi Kushner. I want to read what he has to say, and then I have a lot of insight from Etz Chaim that I'm going to share with you. We once knew a great unity when we were very young. Then all being was one seamless living organism. We were more than a part of it. We were of it, and it was of us. Then we were born, and everything began to fall apart. Mothers and children, fathers and mothers, siblings, lovers, families, villages, nations. Earliest childhood is living in the unity. Adulthood is surviving the brokenness. And what has come to be called spiritual maturity is remembering the ancient unity and trying to reassemble the shards. In fact, that's what exactly tikkun olam really means in the Kabbalah, the repairing of the vessels, because they were shattered. But even now, the world of brokenness we inhabit resides in the bosom of the world of unity, just as each day resides within the larger ocean of memory. God is not yet one with God's name. The prophet Zechariah said it. On that day, the Lord will be one, and the name will be one. When Mashiach comes, we say it every Shabbat. So now the closest Jews come to having a creed reads, Shema, pay attention. Yisrael, you who struggle with God, because as you may recall, that's what Yisrael means when Jacob struggled with the angel and won. Adonai, being in all its variegated forms, is Eloheinu, our God, and Adonai, all being, is Echad, one. Yehido Shel Olam, the only one of being. All right, now I want to read insights into the Shema from Etz Chaim. How did the Shema become the quintessential Jewish prayer when technically it's not a prayer at all? Prayers are addressed to God. The Shema is addressed to the Israelites, right? Probably because it contains in just a few lines the basic theological commitments of Judaism, that there is a God, that there is only one God, that God is not only singular, but also unique. No other being is like God, that the Jewish people have a specially intimate relationship with God, and that we are commanded as Jews to love God wholeheartedly, to study God's word, to teach God's word to our children. More prosaically, it may be that because this passage commands us to study words of Torah, each morning and evening, we fulfill this obligation by reciting this passage, because after all, it's recorded in the Torah. The Shema may be recited in any language. The worshiper understands, because it is crucial that the worshiper understand what he or she is affirming. This is based on Safad Emet, based in the Babylonian Talmud. So again, just like you can't give the excuse, I don't know Hebrew, I can't study Torah. We've already squashed that one. Same here, because Shema is Torah. Shema is in the Torah. Yet there is a value in saying it in the language of the original revelation as a link to the Torah and to Jews around the world. For that reason, these words are typically among the first Hebrew words a Jewish child learns. A midrash, before I tell about the midrash, you may have heard the story that, of course, many Jewish children were saved during the Holocaust by being put in Catholic or schools. In fact, our own congregant, Max Spindler, thank you, told his story as he was one of those individuals. So when these children were in the orphanages, there's the story of a rabbi or a learned Jew, I don't remember, and he was looking for Jewish children, and they said there's none here. But they showed him to the orphanage, and all he did was say Shema Yisrael, and there were children who said, completed the Shema. And that's how he knew that they were Jewish children. That's the first thing we learn when we're children, is the Shema. So a midrash traces the origin of this verse to the last moment of the patriarch Jacob's life. He was concerned that his children and grandchildren living in Egypt would depart from the traditions of Abraham and serve the local gods, that they would assimilate. They put his mind at ease, assuring him, "Hear, O Israel," which of course was Jacob's name changed. "We accept the one God as our God." In Torah scrolls and many prayer books, the letter Ayin at the end of Shema and the letter Dalet at the end of Echad, and you can look in your own Chumash and you will see that. Look at Shema, you'll see the Ayin is big, and Echad, the Dalet is big. They're written larger than the other letters spelling aid, witness. That is to recite Shema is to testify, to witness the unity and uniqueness of God. And when we chant Torah on Saturday, for those of you who attend, please remind me and I'll call those who are interested up to the Torah so they can see it in the scroll. To live by the precepts of the Shema is to bear witness to the truth of God's Torah. It must be true if it can bring ordinary people to such an extraordinary lives. And of course, the Shema is the last thing we are to say when we die. And when Rabbi Akiva was being shredded, his skin shredded off his body by the Romans as he was dying, he was elated to fulfill the mitzvah of saying Shema on his death. All right, so 5 through 9, the V'ahavta. You are to love Adonai your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your being. And these words that I command you today shall be upon your heart. You are to teach them to your children. You are to discuss them when you sit at home, when you journey on the road, when you go to sleep, and when you rise, which is where we got the commandment to say Shema twice a day, morning and evening. Morning and evening. You are to tie them as a sign on your arm, for they are to be tosafot, between your eyes. So what does that mean? And how will we know how to do this without the oral Torah? So you can't understand the written Torah without the oral Torah. You only got half a loaf. You are to write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gateposts. So there is the V'ahavta. Now I want to read insights of the V'ahavta from Etz Chaim. Love is more than emotion. It is a commitment to another, a demand for absolute faithfulness to God and to no other God. How can one command love? The Safat Emet teaches that every human soul instinctively desires to love God. We got this from Abraham. It's in our DNA. But distractions and obstacles intervene. By performing the mitzvot, we remove those obstacles and let our souls fulfill their natural inclination. One who serves a master out of fear will always seek ways of escaping his obligations. But one who serves out of love, obedience is a source of joy. And that is why God pays kindness to 1,000 generations out of fear, 2,000 out of love. And think about it. Those you fear, you're always looking for a way to bend the rule or get out of it, or, weave left or right. But when you do something out of love, there's no bounds to how you want to honor that commitment. True unconditional love. The commandment to love our neighbor is found in Leviticus. The commandment to love the stranger is also found in Leviticus. The commandment to love God comes later in Deuteronomy. We learn to love God by practicing loving God's creatures, our fellow human beings. People who love God love people. And people who love people love God. People who love people are not the loneliest people. Love the Lord your God commands not belief, but behavior. Again, we're a religion of deed. Act in such a way as to make God beloved in the eyes of those who know you with all your heart. Learn to love God not only with our noble impulses, but even with the base, selfless desires of our hearts. Learn to turn to God's service our appetites, our physical lusts, our egocentricity. We do so by sanctifying the way we eat, the way we act sexually, the way we earn and spend money, doing what is right and good. Again, what is permitted, but doing it in a way that sanctifies God. Not in gluttony. Not saying, well, the Torah says I can do it, so I can overdo it. It can also be thought of as wholeheartedly. The opposite of wholehearted love is not hatred, but apathy. Going through the motions with no passion, no real caring, whether one is describing one's attitude toward God or toward family members. Apathy is the worst disease. As Aaron Zeitlin wrote, "Praise me, says God, and I will know that you love me. Curse me, says God, and I will know that you love me. But if you look at the stars and yawn, if you don't praise and you didn't curse, then I created you in vain, says God." With all your soul, even at the cost of your life, Kiddush Hashem, sanctifying God's name. The account of Akiva's death by torture at the hands of the Romans, which again is expounded in the Babylonian Talmud, describes him as reciting Shema Yisrael with his dying breath, so that his death would bear witness to his undying faith in the one true God. Martyr is derived from the Greek word for witness. The ayin and the daled, aid, witness. Jewish law limits the requirements to undergo martyrdom to cases in which Jews are threatened with death unless they commit murder, acts of sexual depravity, or public idolatry in times of persecution. In those three instances, you are to give your life to sanctify God. If someone tells you, if you don't kill this guy, I'm going to kill you, or it tells you to engage in acts of sexual depravity or bow down in public to idols, then you Kiddush Hashem. With all your might. Traditional rendering. With your wealth. We serve God not only by giving to charity, but also by refusing financial gain in ways that either violate God's laws or risk bringing the Torah into disrepute, as when people known to be Jewish are exposed for fraudulent business dealings. Oh, Bernie Madoff comes to mind. But we do, it doesn't have to be someone that famous. Take to heart. If we as a synagogue knew there was a Jew, a member of our community, who engaged in illegal activities and made a large contribution to our synagogue, and we accepted it, then we are guilty as charged. Take to heart, literally, they shall be upon your heart. Why upon rather than in your heart? Much of the time, a person's heart is closed, not ready to receive these words. Let the words remain outside on the heart until the day when circumstances break the heart open and the words of the Torah can enter. Your children, not only your biologic children, but anyone whose impression of Judaism is likely to be shaped by their contact with you. You are my children. The rabbis, their children were anyone who studied in their academies. 8 and 9. The tefillin are personal statements of our committing our deeds and thoughts to God. The mezuzah is a public declaration that this is a home where a Jewish family dwells. Okay, back to the text. Excuse me. 10 and 11. When Adonai your God will have brought you to the land that he swore to your forefathers, to Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, to give you great and good cities that you did not build, and houses full of all bounty that you did not fill, and hewn cisterns that you did not hew, vineyards and olive stands you did not plant, and you will eat and be full. So you're going to benefit from the great and good cities from their labor. Okay? 12. Look out for yourself, lest you forget God, who took you out of the land of Egypt from the house of slavery. So beware, lest this unearned opulence make you forget God. I created my wealth. I did it on my own. No one helped me. Well, this says otherwise. Verse 13. Fear God, your God, and serve him. Swear by his name. So again, this has to do with taking of oaths. So here's what Rashi has to say. And swear by his name. If you possess all these qualities, you fear his name, and you serve him, then you may swear by his name. For since you fear his name, you will be prudent with your oath. Otherwise, you should not swear. Okay? So, verse 14 and 16. Go back to Avodah Zarah. Do not follow other gods from the gods of the peoples around you. This is why, as I've said many times before, it's so important to know who your neighbors are before you settle there. For a jealous Almighty is Adonai your God within you, lest there be aroused the anger of God, your God, against you, and he destroy you from the surface of the land. Do not test Adonai your God as you tested at Massah. What happened at Massah? The waters of strife. So Nehemiah, I want to read from the sin of putting God to the test. This week's Sidra contains allusions to all the main principles of Judaism: the giving of Torah, the Decalogue, the unity of God in the Shema, the duty to love God, to study Torah, you shall teach your children, to put on tefillin and fix a mezuzah. There are also recurring admonitions against forgetting God and a call to fear and worship him. After all this comes the following negative precept: you shall not put the Lord your God to the test as you did at Massah. Beginning with the patriarch of Abraham, who was tried with 10 trials, which are recounted in Pirkei Avot for those who are so inclined to know what those 10 trials are, and ending with the generation of the wilderness, we have seen how the Lord puts his creatures to the test. But what is meant by the test or trial with which man tries or tests God? Some commentators have tried to limit this concept to certain trials. This is how the author of Sefer HaChinuch understands the position in his statement of the 24th precept of you shall not try the Lord. This is what they have to say. We are bidden to refrain from trying overmuch the prophet who chastises the people and instructs them in the path of repentance once his message has been authenticated. To this refers the text. The text, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test, implying that you should not test the Lord's recompense and punishment made known to you through his prophets and not cast doubt on them. But the author of the Sefer HaChinuch observes that this definition is much too narrow interpretation of a much broader and fundamental principle enshrined therein. It also includes the prohibition of not performing a commandment of God on trial, i.e., to see whether the Lord will reward you for your righteousness instead of out of love and fear for him. The Torah itself specifically elaborates in order to clarify the meaning of this prohibition by adducing a concrete example, as you did at Massah. A glance at that incident will show us that more than a test of the prophet's message was involved. What is narrated in Exodus 17? From a closer look, we shall be able to understand how Israel tested God. After the departure of Israel from Egypt, the division of the sea, the sweetening of the waters, the descent of the manna, all performed for their benefit by a beneficent God, they once again broke out in murmurings. And the people contended with Moses, and they said, God, give us water to drink. Moses answered them with a reply that appears irrelevant. Why do you contend with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test? Evidently, Moses saw into their hearts and knew that it was not thirst that prompted their murmurings, but pettiness, doubt, and discontent. Nachmanides, the Ramban, observes that the text underlines this point by using the phrase, they contended, and not they grumbled. They were looking for a pretext, as the following citation indicates in Exodus chapter 17, verse 7. And he called the name of the place Massah, trial, and Meribah, contention. Because of the contention of the children of Israel, they're putting the Lord to the test, saying, is the Lord in our midst or not? The psalmist understood the phrase to try the Lord in a similar light. And this is from Psalm 78, verses 17 through 20. Yet they went on to sin against him, to rebel against the Most High in the desert. They put God to the test in their heart by asking food for their craving. Yea, they spoke against God. They said, can God prepare a table in the wilderness? Behold, he smote the rock, that waters gushed out, and streams overflowed. Can he give bread also? Or will he provide meat for his people? Here, the trial is interpreted in the sense of demanding God to prove himself, to prove his existence and omnipotence by performing miracles. But a more comprehensive explanation, which includes the two previous ones, is given by the Ramban, Nachmanides. The meaning of, as you did at Massah, is that you should not question whether the Lord is in the midst of you to perform miracles, or that you make our worship of him dependent on material success, that we should satisfy ourselves with bread and well-being. How many people do that today? Their love, they put God to the test. It's conditional. And only then shall we observe his Torah. For their intention at Massah was that they would follow the Lord if he gave them water through a miracle. Otherwise, they would forsake him. This was accounted a great iniquity. After God had authenticated his revelation and the mission of Moses through signs and wonders, it was not right to perform any other test. Whoever did so, i.e., demanded a superfluous miracle from the prophet, was not merely trying the prophet, but doubting the power of God. For this reason, it was eternally forbidden to try the Torah or the prophets. God must not be served conditionally and through miracles, since it is not the divine will to perform a trial for any man at any time. I mean, God is not a circus clown to be called on at our whim to do our bidding. He should not be worshiped in expectation of reward, but even in trouble and suffering. That is why when someone dies, the first thing we say is God is the true judge. He should certainly accept everything as exemplifying his justice. The transgression referred to in our text is putting God to proof by reference to the success of our deeds, worshiping him conditionally. The incentive to Torah and faith and loyalty to God must not be the profit motive. That was the transgression not only of the children of Israel in the wilderness, but has been an ever-recurring phenomenon in our history. Constitutes the greatest challenge to the believer. He should believe in God without trying him. Verse 17. Shamor, carefully guard the commandments of Adonai your God, his testimonies, his statutes that he commanded you. 18. Perform the upright and the good in God's eyes, in order that you benefit and arrive in and inherit the good land that Adonai swore to your forefathers. Our sages say the reward for a mitzvah is performing the mitzvah and the ability to perform another mitzvah. 19. To smash all your enemies before you as Adonai declared. Now come the final verses of our triennial, 20 to 25, the lessons of the Exodus. When your son asks you tomorrow, and this should sound very familiar to you, when your son asks you tomorrow saying, what are the testimonies and the statutes and the laws that Adonai our God commanded you? And you will tell your son, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, that Adonai took us out of Egypt with a strong hand. And Adonai set signs and wonders that were great and harmful upon Egypt, upon Pharaoh, upon his entire household as we watched. And he took us out of there in order to bring us into and give us the land he swore to our forefathers. Isn't that what we say around our Seder tables every Pesach?
Talks about the 4 children.
Yep. Adonai commanded us to perform all these statutes to show that we fear Adonai our God, to benefit us for all time, to keep us alive like this day. And then the final concluding verse of the second triennial, 25, it will be to our credit if we are careful to fulfill the entire mitzvah before Adonai our God, as he commanded us, to be holy because the Lord our God is holy, and to do what is right and good in the eyes of the Lord. Be careful to fulfill. Any comments?
I
Questions?
Got a question, Stu.
I just wanted to show you this. I copied a page from my tikkun, and you can see I think you'll see it. I don't know.
Oh, yeah, it's very clear.
The last letter of the Dalet got cut off because it was close to the spine, but you could see the 2 large letters in the regular Hebrew and the one in the Torah script.
And it should be that way in your Chumash, unless it's all in English. And then, of course, you would not have that benefit. But thank you. What were you going to ask, Bobby?
Yes, Stu, let's go back to the first and second commandments where the soul was removed and then put back in place. I'm not quite grasping the point that's being made there.
When
Why is the soul being removed and then put back in?
Go ahead, Ken.
Well, what I was going to say was when God gave the first 2 commandments, the entire people of Israel died. It was like a shock, and everybody died, and God brought them back. It happened again, and they died again, and he brought them back. Finally, they said, "We can't take this. Tell us,
Continue to die.
we can't continue to die. You got to act as our intermediary, Moses. We can't hear what God. We're just. It's killing us to hear what God is saying."
What happens when you die, Bob?
My soul moves on.
Your soul leaves your body. Exactly.
Yeah.
There you have it.
Well, Ken's interpretation of something, Stu, I've never heard, that the 1 million people there at the time died.
It's in the Midrash. Yeah, it's in the Midrash. Yes.
Totally understand now. Thanks.
Yeah,
But that's why
it points out that we, in our limited capacity to study, we don't know the Gemara and the Midrash. And a lot of the explanations, if you go to the Gemara, the Talmud, all of these questions get answered.
that's the oral Torah. And that's why you can't understand the Torah without the written Torah without the oral. They go hand in hand.
Yeah,
As I pointed out, tefillin, tosafot, what does that mean? How are we to display them? What are they to be made of? How could they be comprised? All that was in the oral Torah. So
Doesn't that also reinforce the notion that
Thank you.
there will be a resurrection of all the souls that have passed when the Messiah comes? Because God demonstrated that he did it twice and that his power is there to do it when he returns, or she.
that makes perfect sense. And that's why the sages wanted to be buried, of course, not only in Israel, but the closest to the temple. And why to this day, when we die, we are buried with soil from Israel to ensure the Mechaye Hametim, the resurrection of the dead. And, you know, you can look at it, Ezekiel with the bones, the very famous story of the bones rising, the flesh and sinew of coming. Some say that's metaphorically, some say it literally will happen. But go ahead, Ellen.
If I remember right, I think right after the people, after the second commandment, when the people went to Moses and Moses went to God, then God said they were right to do that.
Correct.
So
Yeah.
can you speak a little bit more about that? Like, what did God mean by he knew that the people would do that, or he wanted them to do that, or what was, you know, it's interesting that God said that.
Because God, of course, created us and he knew our limitations. So he wanted everyone to experience the full, complete divine revelation, which was experienced in the first two commandments. But then after that, to have Moses recount them so they could internalize them through study and through their intellect.
You know, one of the things that comes to mind with regard to that is that it may be that God said that because the people were verbalizing their limitations and abilities, and they needed to trust God to, you know, give them what they needed in the manner that however he was going to give it to them. So it appears to me that that was also why he said that this is good for them to say it.
And maybe another analogy is in an eclipse. If you look up directly at an eclipse, you'll burn out your cornea, you'll go blind. So the only way you can understand and see an eclipse is through a filter, right? So God was like staring at the eclipse, the first two revelations, which is why they died during those two times. And after that, Moses became their filter. So through Moses's filter and lens, they were able to see the eclipse and then internalize it. And as it says, when I read from Kohot, rather you should approach God by yourself, hear all that God our God will say, and you should speak to us all that God our God will speak to you. We will study it and do it. For my part, Moses, I was deeply disturbed over this attitude. Shouldn't you have preferred to learn directly from God rather than from me? But God heard the sound of your words when you spoke to me, and God said to me, I have heard the sound of the words of the people which they have spoken to you. They have spoken well. If only their hearts would be like this, to revere me and keep all my commandments for all time, that it may go well with them and their children forever. So once they got through the utter shock of the divine revelation, I mean, my God, then it had to be at a level that they could inculcate it and understand it. Just like the book of Devarim is not God speaking to Moses, as we recounted last week, that the entire book of Devarim is Moses's interpretation, which is the same as the prophets. The prophets received the vision, and then they interpreted that vision in the manner in which they understood it. Did we help you at all? Do those explanations help you at all?
They're all interesting and useful explanations, but they didn't really address what I was asking. What I was asking was, by saying it was good that the people came to you, it's like God knew that it was too much for them, and yet God did it anyway. So I'm thinking that maybe God wanted them to have the experience as much as they could take, and then was willing to do it anyway.
Well, that's exactly it. Just like God knew that the soul that comes to him repentant through teshuvah is a whole nother level of relationship with God. And in fact, God, I don't want to say prefers the repentant, but that's why God created the whole experience of the golden calf. That Israel should, you again, as it says as I said last week in the Midrash, it says, had I not fallen, I would not have been elevated.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that the Messiah was born on Tisha B'Av to teach us that out of despair come the seeds of redemption. It's a similar thing. You can't rise unless you fall. You can't ascend unless you descend, that kind of thing. Yes, Janet.
Is it possible then, when God spoke the words, that there might have been people there who might not have accepted it? So when their souls rose, they just died and they didn't come back?
I
Or
think
is it-
that's an impossibility to
Okay,
have
so-
the fullness of God's revelation, that evil could not exist.
Okay,
There's no doubts.
so it's 100%.
Correct.
Okay.
I'd like to say something about God prefers the repentant. Well, it's a fact that all man falls short of the glory in terms of living our lives now here on this earth. The problem is when we fall short of the glory that we understand via obeying God's word, because, well, whatever, that every man needs to repent. I don't care who you are. Every man needs to repent. Therefore, God prefers the
right back.
repentant. What?
What happened
He
to
said he'll be right back.
Patricia, did you finish your point?
Oh, I don't know.
Well, keep going. We're listening to you.
Oh.
God
Well,
prefers the
pride. Yeah,
repentant.
right. God, the pride is the worst thing. That's why someone would not repent because of their pride, even though they know it's wrong. And therefore, that is why I think that God said what he did, that he prefers a repentant. That's it.
I want to go back to the other point for a minute, which is, since we're waiting for Sturt anyway. If I were reading it through our Torah and I was trying to find some message for us today, of the people having listened to twice to 2 commandments and then going to God and then God saying, no, they're right. I don't think they can handle this. I would say it's something like, there's so many times in life when we think things are going to be too hard for us, or we start to do something and then it just feels like it's impossible. And so I would say that maybe 2 lessons are, when you think that something's too hard, you need to try it anyway. You have to get past that self-imposed limitation, because you might not know what's at the other side and what you're really capable of. And if it turns out that it's important, but you can't do it one way, then it's important, I think, to look for another way to do it. And that's what happened here. They still got the other 8 commandments, but it was in a way that was doable for them. But nobody gave up. It still happened.
Also to seek assistance, that it's okay to have somebody help you with things. You don't have to do it all yourself. I mean, they needed Moses to explain the rest. I think
And
that's
God
okay.
still speaks to us continually, as we would need to be reminded, through the Torah, through our prophets, through our sages. And as I've said many times before, it's a 2-way relationship. Prayer is us speaking to God. Torah is God speaking to us. So it's essential that we do both.
But we can hear God in different ways too, I think.
So anyway, if we just got a few minutes left, and I'd like to cover the Haftorah if everybody is okay. This is of course, yesterday was Tisha B'Av, the saddest day in Jewish history. And we read Eicha, Lamentations, written by the prophet. Jeremiah. Thank you. Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu. So now we turn to the 7 haftarots of consolation. Now that the temple has been destroyed, both temples, etc., we should be comforted about the coming of the Messiah, the restoration of the temple, etc. Most, I believe, I haven't looked at all 7 and I don't recall, but most of them are from the prophet Isaiah, if not all of them.
I think they all are.
Yeah. And as I said before, Isaiah was the most prolific of the prophets in his writing, 66 chapters, and 20% of our weekly haftarot are taken from Yeshayahu. This one comes chapter 40, verses chapter 1 through 26. Can you hear me? For some reason, it said the host muted me. So, okay. And this is called Shabbat Nachamu. Anyone want to posit why?
It's the first word of the Haftarah.
Thank you. Let's turn to the
Nachamu,
Haftarah.
Nachamu.
If you go to page 776 in Hertz,
It's actually the first 2 words.
yes, it
Nachamu,
is.
Nachamu.
Nachamu, Nachamu, Ami Yomar.
Yomar Elohichem.
Thank you. Comfort, comfort my people, your God will say. So what does that mean? It means you are not to be comforted, but the prophets and God's messengers are being sent to comfort the people. Now, the prophetic reading of this Shabbat is the first of 7 haftarots, as I've told you, that follow the fast of Av. They consist of sublime messages of encouragement that have sustained and fortified Israel during its ordeals of cruelty and persecution throughout the ages. The chapter opens the Rhapsody of Zion Redeemed that occupies the second half of the book of Isaiah. So, in the supreme hour is heard the voice of God's prophet commanded. So Isaiah is commanded to comfort Israel and proclaim the restoration of Zion. Now remember, Yeshayahu lived 150 years before the destruction of the temple. He prophesied under 4 kings, which we read from last week in the 3rd Haftarah of admonition, and the 4 kings of Judah. So his prophecies ended somewhere around 700 before the Common Era. And the temple was destroyed in 586. So let us go on. Verses 1 and 2 are to proclaim the divine forgiveness. So God exhorts mankind to comfort his people. Comfort, comfort my people, your God will say. Speak to the heart of Jerusalem. Call out to her that her army service is fulfilled, that her guilt of sin has been mitigated, for she has won double from the hand of God just because of all of her sins. So her time of punishment is paid off doubly. She's more than amply paid off her sins. So that's the words of comfort that Isaiah is offering. And remember that last week's, which was the first chapter of Isaiah, was when Hezekiah was king, and 49 cities of Judah had been conquered by the Assyrians, and Sennacherib's army was literally at the walls of Jerusalem, and only by a miracle was Jerusalem saved from destruction. 3 to 5. The prophet hears the sound of heavenly voices announcing that Israel's deliverance from exile is at hand. The return from captivity is conceived as a divine triumphant march. So here goes verses 3 to 5. But now a voice calls out into the desert, prepare the way of God, clear in the wilderness the upward leading road to our God. Every valley must be raised, every mountain and hill lowered, and the crooked must become straight, and the unevenness must become level. Then the glory of God will reveal itself, and all flesh will see that as one, that the mouth of God has spoken, which is how so many prophets in their prophecies and so many haftorot, Ki Adonai diber, right? So the mouth of God has spoken. And of course, the valleys being raised refer to the people of Israel. The mountain and hill lowered refers to the destruction of their enemies. So verses 6 through 8 is the second herald. All earthly might is transitory. Israel's oppressors will perish. The word of God alone is eternal. Here we go, verse 6. The voice is saying, declare. And it says what I am to declare. All flesh is grass, and all its devoted love like the flower of the field. You don't get more beautiful prose than from the prophet Isaiah. Just a master of prose. The grass dries out, the flower wilts when the breath of God blows against it. Indeed, the people is like grass. And we read this on Russia during the high holidays. We are like grass. Like the, what is it? Like the leaf that withers, the wind that blows it away. 8, only the grass dries out, only the flower wilts, but the word of our God will stand for eternity. So people come and go, empires come and go, but God is eternal. 9 to 11 is the third herald. Raise yourself up to the high mountain, herald of Zion. Now, Zion is always a metaphor for Jerusalem or for Israel proper. Raise your voice with might, herald of Jerusalem. Lift it up, do not be afraid. Say to the cities of Yehuda, look, here is your God. Behold, the master God who now reveals his loving kindness and justice. He will come forth with the strong one, whose arm rules for him. Behold, his reward is with him, and his workings before his countenance. 11, he pastures his herd like a shepherd, who gathers the lambs in his arm and carries them in his bosom, but guides the nursing mothers. So this picture that's being painted, 2 shepherds come to mind. Of course, one and first is Moses, who was a shepherd of his people, who was a shepherd in the wilderness. And God saw his kindness when he went after the errant sheep and brought him back. He knew that he would be right for the Jewish people to lead them. And then David HaMelech, King David. Now, the theme of this verse is God's loving care for every being, no matter how insignificant. He tends his human flock as the shepherd protects his herd. This refers to the Jewish people in its weakened, exiled state, as divine providence prepares it for the task of becoming nursing ewes who nurse an ailing mankind until it attains spiritual health. The Jews were never at the spiritual depth, the lowest point, and after the exile. All right, 12 through 16. God's incomparable wisdom and might shown in creation and the government of the world. Even still, there are those who are weak in faith, who doubt the possibility of Israel's deliverance. There's always cynics. And unfortunately, in today's world, the world has made us cynical. So to suppress our cynicism with the knowledge of God's incomparable wisdom and might shown in the creation and the government of the world, this is what this speaks to. God, who has measured water with the hollow of his hand and fixed the heavens according to its span, made a measure of the dust of the earth and weighed mountains with the scale and hills on the balance? Well, that's the great Jewish rhetorical question. And of course, it's an obvious answer. No one save God. Who has comprehended the Spirit of God? Who is the man who can advise him of his counsel? 14, with whom did God consult? Who would endow him with understanding? Who would instruct him as to the path of justice? Who would teach him knowledge and let him know the way of understanding? Wow, we got it. Okay. I gotta go. I'm so sorry. You please stay.
Stuart,
Thank you, Stuart.
can I share my, make me host for a minute. I'll share my screen with,
That's Janet. She's the host.
oh. I just want to mention that when
Go ahead, I did it. You're a co-host.
okay, it's let me see if I can. It's very common for biblical and other stuff from the Siddur and the Haftarahs to become popular, and this is the popular version of Nachamu. I won't belabor it, but it's Safam, which was one of my favorite groups. They don't sing together anymore, as far as I know, but they have a number of tracks, a lot of tracks that are a lot of them are all from Torah or Kaddish or all kinds of things, and you can look it up on YouTube. But I think that's a particularly pretty version of Nachamu.
Does it cover the whole Haftarah?
I don't think it does. I don't recall specifically, but
In 3 minutes, 46 seconds?
well, no, because there's, it's like it's a song, so you get repetition. Speak to the heart, Jerusalem, and proclaim unto her. God is the term of punishment. God is the guilt that was hers. See, it just goes back and forth because that becomes the Nachamu becomes the refrain, but it's kind of neat the way they do that.
It is. Thanks for sharing that, Doctor.
And if you look on, you can find there's about, I don't know, at least 50 versions that I've listened to.
Does Safan mean colorful tie?
No, it means mustache. It really does mean mustache.
Really? 2 out of 6.
I wonder how long ago that picture was taken.
Oh, this is probably from, well, it was posted in 1915, but this is pretty old. I mean, it was posted on
2015.
I'm sorry, 2015. Yes, thank you. 100 years ago. What's 100 years between French, right? But no, it was posted 6 years ago. But this dates probably to the 60s or 70s.
Yeah, looks it.
I mean, you can tell by the haircuts. It's pretty, except for his.
But it's still popular.
I mean, you can if you look if you like to listen to Jewish music, just pick something and you can find 20 versions of it. I mean, one of the cool ones is Adon Olam. You can find so many different versions of Adon Olam, and they're all on YouTube, and they're all different, and it's fun to listen to. I mean, even, you know, even when you consider that let me just stop the share. Stop share, there it is. Even when you consider that the liturgy, the nusach, in almost every synagogue that you go to won't be exactly what you recognize. And there's some pretty good stuff out there to listen to. There's a synagogue in California in, I forget where it is. There's it's outside, just outside of Los Angeles. It could be, I don't remember exactly where. And they have a cantor who is Persian. She's from Iran. And she combines modern music with very, very Sephardic sounding music, very Eastern sounding music. It's really cool. It's Shomrei Torah, in a Shomrei Torah synagogue. And so a young woman who's the cantor, and it's a conservative synagogue, and you know, considering that Sherry has the same background, the nusach is entirely different. And if you're ever interested in listening to some of it, you can go to STS online, and because their Shabbos services start at 10 a.m. Pacific time, you can pick it up at noon, and you can listen to a little bit of it. Where you can also listen, or if you want, it's Jackie Rafii, it's Rafi, Rafii, and you can look her up on YouTube, or just look up her name and you'll find her, and you can listen to some of her music, and it's really cool.
Nice.
That's great. Well,
Totally
thank you
unrelated
all.
to
I'm
Torah.
going to sign everybody off now.
Totally unrelated to Torah study, but just interesting. I
No,
hope.
it was related. It was good. Thank you for bringing it up.
It's Jewish, so it's good.
Yeah.
All right, I'll see you next week.
Bye.
Have a good day, everyone. Bye.
Too. Bye-bye.